Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to do something really fascinating. We are diving straight into the complex, unvarnished reality of Abraham Lincoln's presidency by looking directly at the historical source material. We're drawing on some deep historical analyses to figure out who the actual man was behind the monument.
You know, we all know the legend, right? The great emancipator, this self-made frontier hero who essentially single-handedly broke the chains of slavery. But how much of that massive monolithic myth actually holds up when we check the historical record? As historian Eric Foner notes, it seems like every single generation reinvents Lincoln in its own image. So today we're stripping away all those reinventions. We are going to look closely at the actual policies, the intense pressures, and the constitutional clashes that truly defined his time in office.
Just take a second with this really remarkable statement from 1864. It paints a picture of a president who, rather than just flawlessly leading some predetermined moral crusade, was constantly being pushed, pulled, and shaped by massive outside forces. He was trying to navigate an unprecedented national crisis. And as you'll see, his responses were often deeply, deeply pragmatic.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The man and the myth. 2. Slavery, race, and colonization. 3. The Emancipation Proclamation. 4. The war powers debate. 5. Native American policies. And finally, 6. A complex legacy.
Let's move right into Section 1, the man and the myth.
So, the sources reveal a picture of Lincoln that honestly might surprise some of you. He was, first and foremost, a professional politician. For a huge chunk of his career, he actually wasn't an abolitionist. Back in 1837, he even voted with the Illinois legislature to condemn abolitionists, basically believing they were just making things worse. He prioritized the Constitution and keeping the Union together above literally all else. But look, that doesn't mean he supported slavery. He absolutely hated it. He just viewed it primarily through an economic lens, as the ultimate theft of a laborer's natural right to eat the bread they earn with their own hands. As a moderate Republican, his strategy was to stop its expansion and put it on a slow, deliberate road to what he called ultimate extinction.
Moving on to Section 2, Slavery, Race, and Colonization.
It is completely wild to think about today, but for a really significant part of his presidency, Lincoln actively promoted and funded the policy of colonization. And this wasn't just some fringe idea at the time. It was heavily supported by mainstream politicians. The underlying belief was that gradual emancipation, if paired with resettling freed African Americans in places like Liberia or Central America, would kind of soften the blow and lessen white resistance in the South. In 1862, Lincoln even convinced Congress to fork over funding for these specific colonization projects.
And that brings us to this incredibly stark quote from an 1862 White House meeting. It openly highlights Lincoln's deep uncertainties about whether black and white Americans could literally ever coexist peacefully as equals. He explicitly told these leaders that the physical differences were a disadvantage to both, arguing that separation through colonization was just the best path forward. Honestly, it's a very challenging piece of historical reality, and it sits pretty uncomfortably next to the great emancipator myth we're so used to.
Let's jump into Section 3, the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember that quote earlier about events controlling him? Well, by 1862, the pressure cooker was hitting its absolute limit. The Union was dealing with mounting military failures on the battlefield, and white enthusiasm for enlisting was just plummeting. Meanwhile, and this is absolutely crucial, enslaved people were forcing the issue themselves. They were fleeing to Union lines by the thousands, creating a massive crisis the military somehow had to manage. Once the border states were finally secured, Lincoln had the political cover he desperately needed to deter European intervention and actually take action. So, when the proclamation officially dropped on January 1st, 1863, it was a highly strategic, almost surgical move. It didn't just instantly free 4 million enslaved people. In fact, it entirely exempted the loyal border states, because Lincoln knew he had no constitutional authority there. And it exempted Confederate regions already under Union military control, like the entire state of Tennessee. It strictly applied to slaves in areas actively under Confederate control. The Times of London actually mocked it at the time, calling it a papal bull against a comet, meaning it was acting entirely outside its own jurisdiction. Still, it was a vital military measure that fundamentally shifted the whole purpose of the war into a revolutionary struggle to remake Southern society.
All right, Section 4, the war powers debate. Picture this. Early in the war, pro-Confederate mobs in Baltimore are actively destroying rail lines and threatening the only supply routes into Washington, D.C. In response, Lincoln unilaterally authorized the military to suspend the Great Writ of Habeas Corpus. Essentially, the military could now arrest and hold civilians indefinitely without a trial. Which forces us to ask a pretty profound constitutional question. When public safety is genuinely threatened by a rebellion, who actually has the power to just suspend civil liberties?
Well, this sparked an absolute heavyweight constitutional clash. On one side, you have Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney. He pointed out that the suspension clause is located in Article 1 of the Constitution, which covers legislative powers. So by his logic, only Congress can suspend the writ. On the other side, prominent lawyer Horace Binney and Lincoln himself argued that Article 2 gives the president broad executive powers to wage war and protect the public safety. Since emergencies require split-second action and Congress isn't always in session, Lincoln argued the commander-in-chief absolutely must hold this power.
But Lincoln, he didn't sit around waiting for a consensus. He acted. When Chief Justice Taney formally ruled against him in May 1861, Lincoln literally just ignored the ruling. By September 1862, he went even further and unilaterally ordered nationwide martial law. It actually took Congress nearly 2 whole years, until March 1863, to finally pass a habeas corpus act to authorize what Lincoln was already doing. And later, when Congress tried to put some guardrails on him by demanding lists of prisoners, the Lincoln administration masterfully dragged its feet and effectively bypassed those restrictions too.
Moving to Section 5, Native American Policies. So while the Emancipation Proclamation was a massive leap forward in one arena, we have to look at the other side of the coin. The administration's policies rapidly accelerated Western expansion, heavily at the expense of Native Americans. You had the Homestead and Pacific Railway Acts of 1862, which triggered just massive tribal land loss. Tribes were increasingly forced onto reservations, and corrupt government agents were routinely siphoning off their vital resources. Now, there were some diplomatic gestures, like Lincoln presenting silver-headed canes to Pueblo leaders to recognize their sovereignty. But overall, his tenure in the West was overwhelmingly defined by displacement and severe violence.
450. To put that into perspective, that is the agonizing distance, in miles, of the forced march endured by the Navajo and Mescalero Apaches starting in 1863. The Lincoln administration oversaw their complete removal from the New Mexico Territory, forcing them on this brutal march to Bosque Redondo. Tragically, over 2,000 Native people perished there before a treaty was finally signed.
And we have to look at another incredibly stark figure here, 38. Following the 1862 Dakota War in Minnesota, 303 Native men were sentenced to hang. Now, Lincoln did step in to personally review the cases, and he pardoned the vast majority of them, but he still allowed the execution of 38 Native men to proceed. It stands as the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and it remains a very harsh reality of his administration's frontier policies.
Finally, Section 6, a complex legacy.
As the Civil War was finally drawing to a close, Lincoln's own internal understanding of the conflict had deepened so profoundly. This haunting, heavy quote is from his second inaugural address in 1865. Historian Eric Foner actually describes this as one of the most frightening speeches ever given by an American president. Because instead of claiming some glorious, righteous victory, Lincoln candidly points right to the brutal evil of slavery, 250 years of stolen wealth and blood drawn by the lash. He's essentially suggesting that the absolute devastation of the Civil War was a staggering national cost, exacted by God to purge that deeply rooted sin.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. Based on Eric Foner's analysis, I really want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How do we reconcile all of this? How do we view the legacy of a man who broke the chains of slavery and saved the Union, while at the exact same time acting as a hyper-pragmatic politician, stretching the Constitution literally to its breaking point and leaving so many other American wounds, particularly for Native Americans, completely unresolved? What does justice actually require when we look at the unvarnished facts of history? Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the past.